So, to launch a discussion about Putin's Russia now, we have a terrific panel. And I'd like to introduce our moderator, Don Jensen, and Don will take it from here and introduce the full panel. So, Don, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Great to see all of you again. I want to thank the Georgian organizers, especially Nino, of course, all her team, and Kurt and the McCain Institute for bringing us back to a country and people that we love. Boy, do we have a panel for you. I take it that was about Putin. We can't see it here. This panel is about two questions. Why is Putin still there, and will he ever leave? And the second question is, if he decided to leave, could he? And I want that to animate our discussion about Putin's Russia and its future. I should say it's also a personal pleasure because we're all friends here on the panel, and we're going to discuss, we pretty much discuss every day over internet anyway, and a very interesting always and fascinating set of discussions. And I asked the question about the succession in Russia's future at an odd and interesting time. As you know, Putin was just re-elected to another term, yet people are already talking about his departure. And we see, I think, enough evidence around, both in Russia's behavior overseas and also at home, to suggest that we're in a very interesting and perhaps critical moment for Russia and Putin. At home, we see the remarkable decline in the spring of Putin's poll ratings, the traditional debate in many countries about guns or butter, or in this case, guns or pension reform. We see evidence of social ferment in new areas, and I've heard not just to Moscow, but Siberia and the Far East, where the populace is usually pretty quiescent. And we see a lot of suggestions that things are bubbling along in a way that may promise some change. And in foreign policy, we see also a very interesting seventh phenomenon. Russia at the one time wants to be a great power, at the same time it wants to blow up and create chaos in the international system. And that to some extent is chaotic and contradictory, but worth noting. They're talking sweet to the Europeans recently. At the same time, America remains the main enemy. They're prisoners of sanctions on the one hand, but Putin shows no indication of seriously withdrawing from Ukraine. They're still very active in Syria, and as we've talked about in the previous panel, they're very active in influence operations around the world. So let's get started, and I wanted to ask one of our Russian friends really about what will happen now in terms of the succession scenario. Will maybe, Mr. Kasyanov, will Putin leave? I mean, there's a lot of talk about various structures being formed. I mean, what would you say? Is he going to serve his whole term? Can he leave? And so forth.
Thank you, Don. Dear friends, first to get a better understanding of what's going on inside my country, and especially in the minds of these people, Mr. Putin in particular, it is necessary to understand what the motivation Mr. Putin has. And in fact, yesterday we've heard on a debate that is some kind of expression that Putin wants to keep the situation, the affairs like they are. And I'd like to emphasize that he doesn't have any specific strategic plan, as some people say, just to make Russia greater, etc., etc. He simply wants to be respected by outside world. He wants to create danger for neighbors. He doesn't want the future of nations around, like Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, and others, would be resolved, those futures were determined by people themselves. He wants to be part of this discussion, whether it's allowed to Georgian to take a European choice or not. That's why just all his activities and deeds, they are not a part of any specific strategic plan. That's simply he resolving the issues as soon as they appear. And we can say that, of course, changes are inevitable, But the changes for Mr. Putin and his particular, I would say, moment of his departure depends on us Russians inside the country and our friends outside. Why it depends of our friends outside? Because of the simple reason, Russian economy, that's half export-oriented economy, and trade relations with the major markets, that's crucially important. Cheap money inflow is crucially important, and as soon as you see just all those aspects just deteriorated recently, Russian economy started to slow down and to stop growth. In the last 4 years, we see real decrease of real income of people. People start to understand that why we live worse than yesterday. And departure of Mr. Putin depends of internal situation. And to answer your question, Donald, I would say that maybe in such a pressing environment what we have now, I mean sanctions as one component of that, maybe there is a scenario that Mr. Putin decides to leave even before his 6-year term. You said he was elected. I wouldn't say this, that he was elected. He created, I would say, the mechanism to be re-inaugurated and to step into the Kremlin again. With such elections, which he did it, we cannot call it elections, and we cannot call it he was elected. But he has a mandate for a 6-year term, and I think he would be looking for a successor, so that the successor should accumulate all negativism, all negative aspects appear in Russia, and maybe start somehow trying to improve relations with the West. With, of course, the full guarantees to Mr. Putin, because impunity, that is an important thing for all of them, and availability, that's important. They, of course, shouldn't be touched. That's what the system he is thinking about.
Okay. Lilia, if you look at, will the way Russia is ruled continue, do you think, after Putin departs, or change in a significant way domestically, or is this something that we're locked into? What do you think?
Don, you're making a mistake, because, well, I would like to go after David Kramer in order to argue with him. But, okay, thank you for your question. You allow me to add to our narrative a bit of irony. A bit. Bitter irony. I don't think that there are reasons to believe that Putin's departure suddenly will change the system. Just on the contrary, it seems to me the most probable option, at least in the current circumstances, is that the regime change, he's getting out or ousting out or fighting him out, could give the system of personalist power in Russia a new shot of adrenaline, some kind of impetus to limp along or limp back, or at least to survive for some time, as it happened so many times in Russian and Soviet history. And the successor chosen by Putin, that Mikhail Kasyanov just mentioned, a very probable option, will try to legitimize himself, because there are no other ideas to do that, by cracking down on his successor. Just like Khrushchev did with Stalin, Brezhnev with Khrushchev, Gorbachev with the rest, and Yeltsin with Gorbachev. And so the result will be that the system will get some animation, maybe some resilience for a very brief period of time. Because in fact, Russia is tired of the guy, definitely tired. Because firstly, he betrayed his own basis, the pension reform. He betrayed his own political elite, sanctions against the elite. Usmanov and Abramovich have to get out of London, not because of James Nixon, but because of sanctions, okay? So that's why, you know, people openly, allegedly supporting him, 70% of approval rating. In fact, only 17% of Russians believe that Putin is endorsing or pursuing Russian national interests. So that's why the regime change could give some life to the system. But then we really have much bigger problem, not Putin's problem, but Russia problem. And I don't know really what to do with this problem. It's a kind of a headache, because the system that will continue to exist after Putin probably cannot guarantee development, cannot guarantee stability and security, cannot guarantee any kind of perspective. And it already, you know, hardly will have support of the majority of the population. And it cannot be reformed from the top. Just look at the Russian political elite. Who will reform it from the top? The most, I would say, I wanted to use another word, but the most, I would say, demoralized elite maybe in the Russian history. So the only possibility in this situation for Russia, and this is the Russia challenge, not Putin's challenge, is to wait for tsunami. 70% of Russians want change. 70% of Russians, maybe different change, but want change. So Russia is pregnant with tsunami. And at the same time, it seems to me that we all are afraid of this tsunami, because who on earth will come to the fore? And this will be really a drama, expectation, civilization challenge not only for us Russians, but for the surrounding world. Did I scare you enough?
I was going to ask a follow-up question, which is the poll rating.
Oh, me, not David.
David, too. The poll rating, any other panel. The poll rating, when you're in Washington eating wraps and having espresso around the working groups and think tanks, the question always comes up, what's Putin's poll rating? And the answer is always, 75, 82, he's in good shape. But I'm always unsatisfied with that answer. And I would like Vladimir to go ahead and talk about Putin's poll rating. I mean, if you're sitting there watching Dynamo Moscow play soccer, and Levada calls up and says, do you support Putin? I guess they go, well, yeah. But, well, please, Vlad, tell us more about the poll rating.
Thank you, Don, and thank you to the organizers of the conference for hosting all of us here in Tbilisi. And thank you for the question, because I continue to be astonished at how many Western policymakers and analysts and journalists seriously speak about opinion polls in today's Russia. It is absolutely meaningless to talk about opinion polls and sociology in an unfree society, in an authoritarian state, in a situation where millions of people have no access to objective information because all the national television channels are rigidly controlled by the government, and national television channels account for 80% of the population as a primary source of information. But that's not even the main part of it. The main part of it is what Don has just alluded to. I mean, look, imagine you sit in your kitchen somewhere in Russia, and you know everything is going on in the country. You know that people can be sacked from their jobs or beaten up at opposition rallies for opposing the government, or something much worse can happen. You know that people who oppose Putin are daily denounced on state television as national traitors and enemies of Russia and foreign agents. You know all of this. And you get a phone call, somebody who knows your phone number. Or even worse, you get a knock on the door, and some person you've never seen before comes in and says, what do you think about Vladimir Putin? What are you going to say? This is completely meaningless. And as the history of not just Russia, but many other authoritarian regimes have shown, these bogus poll numbers have very little, if anything, to do with reality. As my good friend Boris Vishnevsky, a member of the Legislative Assembly of St. Petersburg, likes to say, Nicolae Ceausescu had 99% in approval polls 2 weeks before his overthrow. And I always thought this is just a nice-sounding phrase. I went and fact-checked it. That is actually true. And as so many dictators have found out, the poll figures or the bogus election results are a very poor indicator of what actually happens. And, you know, dictators are known for producing impressive election results. Suharto had 75%, Mugabe had 90%, Ceausescu had 95%. That's the official result of the last election he took part in. That didn't help them. And neither will the results that we hear about Putin. That's even funnier when people speak about election results in Russia today as an indicator of the situation. Prime Minister Kasyanov was absolutely right to point out that every time we use the words election or elected with regard to today's Russia, we have to put the word in quotation marks. This is not an election. Just look at the so-called presidential election we had 6 months ago. And I'm not even talking about the media controls or the administrative pressure on voters or the ballot stuffing and 90+% results for Putin in many regions that were announced. These are all true, but these are minor difficulties compared to the principal thing. And the principal thing is that there were no opponents on the ballot. And I was so envious, I have to admit, sitting here yesterday and today at this conference, listening to all the debates between, about the upcoming Georgian election and the candidates and the issues. And, it's a novel feeling to have an election that's coming up in 2 months' time and to not know the result of it, which is what people here are talking about. We haven't had that in decades. And in the so-called presidential election that we had on the 18th of March, I think it's important for people not to forget that there were two major opposition candidates who were planning to run against Vladimir Putin in 2018. One was Boris Nemtsov, the former deputy prime minister of Russia, and the other was Alexei Navalny, the prominent anti-corruption activist, as you of course know. Neither of them was on the ballot on the 18th of March. Boris Nemtsov, because in February of 2015 he was gunned down on the bridge 200 yards from the Kremlin. And Navalny was not on the ballot because he was deliberately barred from running by a Russian court decision that was judged by the European Court of Human Rights to have been arbitrary. Now, it's not difficult to win an election when your opponents are not on the ballot. So let's please stop talking about opinion polls and ratings and election results when we're talking about the Putin dictatorship.
We'll get to foreign policy in a few minutes, but I want to follow up on this a little bit more. One of the striking things about the poll ratings, inaccurate as they are, is that Lilia talked about people who are tired, but trust in the government, trust in Medvedev, trust in almost every other institution is quite low. And one of the cliches about Putin is not only that he's a strategic genius, but that he's firmly in control at home. And the pension demonstrations, among other, suggest that maybe he's not, that maybe they're capable of being surprised as well. Did they know the reaction to the pension plan would be that way? I don't know, but it seemed like they were surprised, and that raises the possibility of change unexpectedly and maybe in directions we don't know. Lilia's nodding, but it's a situation that doesn't seem below the surface as stable as it might be. And the other question I would have, or point I would make, is that the so-called patriotic mobilization over Ukraine and Syria and Crimea and elsewhere, Crimea of course being part of Ukraine, seems to have worn off. They're tired. So what do they do to keep up the support for the regime? Lilia, what do they do? How do you keep this, Mikhail, what do they do to, is it a drug? You have to keep injecting the system with a drug, and the system gets used to the drug, and you have to try something else?
No, you absolutely agree that the situation is not so stable. Of course, Mr. Putin has just the only one direction left, just to continue to press and squeeze the whole environment and demonstrative beating people on the streets. Just the overall, I would say, structure of society is such that now in Russia, majority of our people, average age of generations living in Russia right now, just around 40 years. That is like an old Europe. We are in a demographic crisis right now. We have not a lot of youth. That's why majority of people who live in Russia, they have something to lose. That's why they're very, I would say, it's easy to manipulate by them, and demonstrating how easy they can lose everything, including their freedom. That's they can see every day on television. That is the pressure on the population. That's the major driving force. But why I'm saying that departure is possible, because Mr. Putin cannot keep this stability, as they always say, just his main achievement, stability in a society. There is no stability. Vladimir has just mentioned that ratings doesn't produce anything. Mr. Putin never has more than 50% of votes. It's a lot. 52% he got in the year 2000. All years after, he get less than 50%. They reported 65, 75, but now even this 50%, the part of society which supports him, just reducing. And Mr. Putin wants to be a hero who raised Russia and the greatness of Russia, but now, already 4 years in a row, be going down. That's why he needs somebody to take it, to replace him temporarily, to take this old negativism. He made a mistake on the pension reform he just mentioned. Before, he never made and never, I would say, and touched his personal name with some negative developments. Now all people in Russia knows just the increase of pension age, that's Mr. Putin's desire. Although people who are involved in the economy understand that there is no actual current need for that. And Mr. Putin himself explained to people directly, for an 8-year period, we definitely don't need just to raise the pension age. But it means Mr. Putin believes that for 8 years he has money to keep the situation like it is in pension, but there would not be an economic growth. He doesn't want to change his policy. It means he will put Russia on survival track and continue to fight with the West. And in 2-year time it would be, maybe 3-year time would be disaster. Right now people want changes. 80% of people want changes. But whether we like or not, but this majority of this 80% would like just some magic changes without their participation, without suffering. They would like tomorrow just God come and change and start living better, without any suffering, without sacrificing, just to live better. But they would like changes. No one, no Putin, no opposition, make these populist proposals. That's why just people don't trust to anyone.
It's a good segue to a question for, I guess, Vladimir, you again, about the opposition, the democratic opposition. What are their prospects? We've seen both some electoral successes in a relative sense, but what are the possibility of them playing a serious political role, do you think?
Thank you for that question too, Don. And again, we go into the debate about the terms and the words. Like when you mentioned election in terms at the beginning, it's the same thing with the opposition. In one of his last interviews, I think it was at the end of 2014, Boris Nemtsov was interviewed by, I think it was a Ukrainian journalist, and the journalist said something similar to what you just said, how would you assess the, he said, as one of the Russian opposition leaders, and Boris broke him off and says, please stop calling us opposition leaders. We are dissidents, we are not opposition leaders, because opposition sits in parliaments. We usually sit in prison. And that's a major difference, because in a normal political system, in normal democratic countries, you measure the state of the opposition, well, like you do here in Georgia, by the number of seats in parliaments, by the percentages they get in elections. Our parliament is not a place for discussion, as Boris Gryzlov, his former speaker, has famously said it. I was recently at a conference speaking after an activist, a pro-democracy activist from Papua New Guinea, who was speaking, and he was lamenting the fact that, the Parliament of Papua New Guinea only has one genuine opposition member. Well, I came up to him in a break, and I said, well, you know what, that's one more than we have, because we have 0. And not for the lack of support, because the opposition is generally not allowed on the ballot. As for election results, we already spoke about election results, and I think it's important, the fact that Prime Minister Kasyanov mentioned that the only time Putin really won an election was in the year 2000. More than 18 years ago. And this is not us saying this. If you look at the reports from the OSCE or the Council of Europe, who sent observers to every Russian election for the last 2.5 decades, we consider this the gold standard of election observation in Europe. And the last time that they considered a Russian national election to have been more or less free and fair was in the year 2000. Not a single one since then has even come close to passing the test. So we cannot use any of the normal measurements to assess the state of opposition, which is what your question is. And frankly, I think, when the leader of the opposition is assassinated 200 yards from the Kremlin, and for 3.5 years there's a continuing government-led cover-up of his assassination, with state protection of all the organizers and masterminds. That is the state of our opposition. It is symbolized by Bolshoi-Moskvoretsky Bridge. But that is one part of the story. And the other part of the story, which is, I think, much, much more optimistic, is that despite everything that we have been speaking about, despite the media censorship, despite the repression, despite the intimidation and the election fraud, there are many people all across Russia who are fed up with this situation, who are fed up, first of all, with the fact that they have lived their entire lives, for many people, under one person. You know, when my parents spoke about Leonid Brezhnev, who was in power for 18 years and who was a symbol of Soviet totalitarian stagnation, for me, when I was growing up, this seemed something completely ludicrous. Well, Putin's now been in power longer than Brezhnev. This year will mark the 19th year in December. And we now have an entire generation of Russians who have grown up not knowing any other political reality. All they remember is Putin. Let's not forget that as well. And yet, it is the representatives of that generation, of the young people, who are more and more actively going to the streets all across the country to voice their protest against this regime and its endemic corruption and the political conditions that have allowed for this corruption and the lack of transparency and accountability. And again, the sheer fact that one person has been sitting in power for almost 2 decades. And we saw a glimpse of that reality last year when more than 200 towns and cities in Russia, from Kaliningrad to Khabarovsk, participated in those anti-corruption protests. And tens of thousands of people went to those anti-corruption protests knowing what will happen to them. Let's remember as well that going out to protest against the government in Moscow is not like to go out to protest in London or Paris or Washington, where you're protected by the police and your free assembly rights are protected by the police. In Russia, you're arrested and beaten up by the police when you go to protest. And yet so many people do. Ambassador Taft yesterday in his remarks was telling the story of this young woman in Moscow who was asked why she went to that protest knowing what's going to happen to her. And she said, because I don't see any future, any prospects for my country under this regime. And there are so many stories like this. And there are so many people like this. And it's frankly very heartening to see so many young people, despite the pressure and the dangers and intimidation, who go out to the streets to protest for themselves and for their future and for their country. And the fact that so many of these protesters are young people, the predominant age of the protesters throughout the last year, and again this past Sunday in the anti-pension reform protests. And by the way, this coming Sunday, September 16th, there is a big rally planned in St. Petersburg, in downtown St. Petersburg, by a large coalition of opposition groups that includes my own Open Russia movement, that includes Yabloko Party, a Just Russia Party, and many others. We'll see what the turnout for that will be. The authorities have banned it once again, but I think the turnout will be very big despite that. And the fact that so many of these protesters have been young people, late teens, early 20s, university students, high school students, I think it's a very worrying sign for the Putin regime, no question about it, but I think it's a very hopeful sign for the future of Russia.
Thank you. Let's turn to foreign policy for a bit, and I'm going to bring James and David into the conversation. And I guess for James, I would say, or David too, given the situation we have outlined, maybe instability, uncertainty, does that make Russia a more aggressive power, or does that make Russia a less aggressive power, more interested in an accommodation with the West? The argument goes both ways, but I'm very curious, gentlemen, what you think about that question.
Okay, thanks very much. Can I just add one thing to Vladimir's point before I answer your question? Because it's by way of disagreement, you've invoked Boris Nemtsov several times today, Vladimir, and I remember at the Lennart Meri conference 10 years ago, Boris Nemtsov was asked, is the system sustainable? And he said, no, it's not sustainable, but neither was the Soviet Union, and look how long the Soviet Union lasted. And I just to inject a note of realism, but I can see, most economists tell me that it's kind of doing okay. But my issue is that I think that Putin is bequeathing a terrible legacy to his successor rather than anything else. So I just wanted to put that in there. But I don't want to avoid your question. So weak versus strong. Look, of course there's a danger from a weakened Russia. I mean, that's what they say. A frustrated Russia lashes out, a weakened Russia lashes out. You hear it a lot from the apologists and the accommodationists, by the way. That's their argument for no sanctions. If you weaken Russia, look what will happen. Russia will be more anti-Western. But come on, guys. I mean, what can be more what can be more opposed than diametrically opposed? We're already there. So, so on balance, a stronger Russia, logically, a stronger Russia can more easily duff up its neighbors. A stronger Russia can more easily undermine the West, as per the last panel. So on balance, it seems to make sense that a weaker Russia is more preferable. But as for aggression, it takes these forms. I'm a bit uncomfortable sitting here in Georgia with 20% of the country occupied and saying to you that I don't believe that Russia is after more soil, is an expansionist power. Well, I often say that, but of course Russia uses aggression, physical aggression, when it's the most opportune means to do so. And that has been proven the case in two or three cases, if you include Moldova as well. But clearly, what could be more aggressive, however, than... I can barely imagine anything more aggressive than what could conceivably be called the greatest political crime of the 21st century in subverting the American election and replacing the probable leader, would have been leader, with the one we have now. At least it's conceivable, anyway. I can barely conceive of anything greater, except, of course, hang on a minute, a chemical weapons attack and a radiological weapons attack on the British mainland. Again, it's hard to imagine, when people keep asking me the state of the UK-Russia relationship, and where have we reached the bottom of the barrel, I keep saying, I genuinely don't know where the bottom of the barrel is, I guess. But although I tend to think that these events have the power, lose their power to shock and awe, and that although people are up in arms right now over Skripal, other things, then actually they tend to, people forget very quickly. It's what the other day, there was an Australian politician saying, we should forget about MH17, we should move on. Juncker said it as well recently. Good grief. That's my way of saying, I think on balance, it's not my aim to weaken Russia. I know the argument that we don't want a housewife in Voronezh blaming the West for what has become of Russia, but nonetheless, I think we've got to hold tight there.
A few quick points, if I can. One is, and my colleagues have made this point at many other conferences, Putin is not Russia, Russia is not Putin. I think we do need to be specific in talking about the Putin regime, which is a thoroughly corrupt, rotten, authoritarian regime. There are many Russians, including, I bet, the three up here, who don't support him. But there are a lot more Russians inside Russia who don't support him. They hunger for change. They're not quite sure where it comes from, but I'm sure they would be thrilled to see some change. Second, these regimes seem stable until they're not. We never quite know what the tipping point is for these regimes. I don't know anyone who predicted what happened in Tunisia when a market vendor set himself on fire and literally ignited a revolution throughout the Arab world. There weren't many who predicted the fall of the Soviet Union. So we shouldn't assume automatically that the Putin regime will be there forever. He's going to die at some point, and maybe sooner rather than later. Third, President Trump, candidate Trump, then President Trump, asks the wrong question. It's not, wouldn't it be great if Russia and the United States got along? The answer to that question is obvious. Of course it would be wonderful. Who up here would oppose better Russian-US relations? The right question to ask is it possible without sacrificing American values, interests, neighbors in this region, and interests elsewhere around the world? And the answer to that question, I think, is also obvious. No. It is not possible to have good relations with a regime with whom we have zero in common in values, increasingly fewer and fewer interests in common. That, to me, is the right question. It's not to argue that we should never talk to the regime. We have to. Its size, its power, even if it's weaker than it was, demand that. But it's to say we can fall into a trap by enabling this regime, perpetuating this regime, and betraying the people up on this stage and others in the audience. And that, I think, would not only be a crime, it would be a mistake.
Let me follow up, David. Very interesting. A question about domestic and its link to foreign policy, which is to say, there does seem to be, and this is referring to a Levada poll earlier this week, that pride in Russia's return as a great power is one of the things that sustains whatever support Putin may or may not have. Is that true? And the argument is always made in Washington that this substitutes for the oil boom of 10 years ago. Is that true? Does great power status mean that much, do our three Russian panelists think? And would Russia, or would Russians accept a pullout of Ukraine or a diminished role in Syria? I mean, to what extent are people who argue this mistaken? And Putin said we're agreeing to the Minsk or whatever it might be.
Right. No, it means, people would like to have it, and that is this feeling, to have this feeling of greatness, and that everyone we are counted in the world, etc., all the things, and that is why Mr. Putin has this propaganda machine without any single independent TV channel, without any single with the appropriate circulation newspaper which can deliver something to people. Internet, right, this is the only thing, internet. It's growing internet. Like 80 million people right now use internet. Unfortunately, only 5% of this 80 million use internet as a source of information. All others use it for entertainment purposes. But these 15% of people who use internet and definitely can compare different point of views and make their own conclusion, understand that it is wrong and propaganda, but 50% continue to be a fruit of this propaganda. Only now, as I mentioned, feeling that they have a decrease in their living standards, they started asking questions, but they cannot find answers. Because just answers is three-step answer or two-step answer. But who can give these answers? Opposition. But opposition cut off any channels of communication. Through internet, again, we're locked with the same society. We're locked with the same 15% of our everyday support. In the big cities, middle-class people, etc. That is the issue, that Russians would like to see it. But, as I said, they would like to have these changes but the magic way. They don't believe that, for instance, Syria, that's something important for them. They don't even count this situation right now. They already fed up of Ukrainian affair. That's why we don't have Ukrainian affair on the television propaganda channels anymore, to a certain extent. But Mr. Putin now has to find something else. He already found the United States and the West, Great Britain and others, and he continued to turn this circle just and creating the atmosphere just that we're surrounded by enemies, and all these enemies would like to deprive Russia of our sovereignty, etc., etc., etc. That is already a long story, but it continued to work. As I said, pension reform, so-called, it's not a reform. It's simply just cutting expenditure without allowing people just to increase their living standards. Cutting expenditure now, instead of making an economic growth to raise living standard, and then in 8 year time to increase the pension age, which would correspond to just almost European standard. Right now, Russia is still an undeveloped country on this. People coming to the pension at 65 could live in a pension for 2-3 years. That is overage. In 48 regions in Russia, out of 85 regions, in 48, only 40% of men could live till 65. It means in some regions there will not be man pensioners. And people understand this, and Putin understands that, but he wants money now. He doesn't want to wait, and he cannot capable to pursue reforms, because any reforms it's risk and good relations with the West. But how to eliminate these circumstances which push you to impose these sanctions? He doesn't want to eliminate all this because it's his steps. He wants you to accept his regime as a decent, as a normality. And he doesn't understand why. Just believing in gods or whatever, just devoting to those values, you don't go to this situation and not have a contract. Mr. Putin liked very much just Mr. Trump's suggestion, like make a deal, like make a transaction. And David just very reasonably said just what kind of transaction could be, whether the American establishment would allow Mr. Trump to get such a contract, which deteriorating and just cutting all those values, to depart from all those values. I think not. And I think Mr. Trump also understands this. But there's other story just about his overall attitude to this. But to conclude this idea, as I said, the change is possible, pressure is continue and making the result. That's why, whether he wants or not, Mr. Putin is looking for the exit. What kind of exit? For himself, for this regime? Of course, the system, that's not totalitarian yet, but semi-totalitarian already. And all people around would like continuation of this, even without Mr. Putin. But that will be a much more fragile system if Mr. Putin departs. That's why I'm saying just there are changes already there, just far what we can already see there. We should be prepared for that. We should be consistent and principled in our attitude to this. Us inside Russia and you outside.
Vladimir.
Thank you, Don. And you actually raise a very important point about this great power status and the great power myth. I mean, the whole system, the whole regime built by Vladimir Putin is built on a series of myths. And one of the biggest myths it's built on is this myth of a Russia rising from its knees, that Putin inherited, a weak country after the horrible, wild 1990s, whatever cliches the Kremlin propaganda puts out. Maybe it's a historian in me, but I always like to deal with facts as opposed to the myths. And okay, let's just look at the facts. Only looking at Russia's place in the world now, nothing else. It was in the horrible and wild 1990s that Russia was accepted as a full member to the Council of Europe and that our citizens were put under the protection of the European Convention of Human Rights. It was in the horrible and wild 1990s that Russia was invited to join the G8, the club of the leading and the most respected world nations. In fact, this year marks the 20th year of the first G8 summit, full G8 summit that took place in May of 1998 in Birmingham, United Kingdom. In the horrible and wild 1990s, Russia had the goodwill of the entire democratic world, and I can go on. Look what Mr. Putin has done. He's got us kicked out of the G8. He's got our voting rights suspended in the Council of Europe. He's basically turned us into a pariah state that people in the West are scaring their children with. He turned us into a country, where the United Nations General Assembly votes against us by 100 votes to 10, or whatever the Crimea vote count was. For the first time in almost a century, he made Russia a country with unrecognized international borders. Now, to me, none of this speaks about great power status or rising from its knees. In fact, it speaks to the exact opposite. I'm not even talking about the crippling economic sanctions that have been imposed against our country because of Putin's policies. And so that's just one more big lie in a series of lies on which the Putin regime is based. And I think it's very important also to establish this connection that David Kramer just spoke about between the domestic and the foreign posturing of the Kremlin and of the Putin government, because as Russian history shows us clearly, domestic repression and external aggression always go hand in hand. And those Western leaders who tried this naive or cynical, whatever you want to call it, approach of turning a blind eye on Putin's domestic authoritarian abuses in the early years of his regime, in a hope or in an attempt to find some sort of accommodation with him in international affairs, well, we know how this ended. And they turned a blind eye for a pretty long time. When George Bush looked into Putin's eyes and got a sense of his soul, This was after the Federation Council reform, when the upper house of parliament was turned from elected to appointed. This is after the appointment of Kremlin super envoys to the regions, which was a major blow to Russian federalism. This was after the takeover of NTV in 2001, which was the largest private television channel in Russia, which was taken over forcibly by the state. When President Obama declared his reset in the beginning of 2009, oh my God, this was after everything already, and including the attack on Georgia, but also including everything that happens domestically in Russia, after the rigged elections, after the political prisoners, after the media censorship. And I don't want to single out just the Americans. It wasn't just the Americans by any means. I remember I was a journalist in my former life, and I remember in June of 2003, literally, that's not a figure of speech, literally 2 days after Vladimir Putin's government pulled the plug on the last independent nationwide television channel in Russia. It was called TVS. It was switched off in June of 2003 by order of Press Minister Mikhail Lesin with a very Soviet explanation in interests of the audience. 2 days after that happened, Vladimir Putin was treated to a lavish, literally royal reception at Buckingham Palace and the London Guildhall. And I was there. I remember people cheering him and singing, "Oh, you're a jolly good fellow." And it seemed absolutely mind-boggling, 2 days after his government basically introduced full-blown government censorship of the media in Russia. But I'm saying this because at the end of the day, it wasn't just wrong and immoral, in my view, for the leaders of countries that claim to be, to have their systems based on their adherence to democracy and rule of law, to turn a blind eye on election fraud, on media censorship, on beating up of peaceful demonstrators, on political prisoners, and so on. It's not just wrong and immoral. It also backfired because of that link between domestic repression and external aggression. Why should a government that violates its own laws and disrespects the rights of its own people, why should it respect international norms or the interests of other countries? And sure enough, those Western leaders who turned a blind eye for years on election fraud, media censorship, and political prisoners in Russia, one day woke up to the attack on your country, on Georgia, and again, another day they woke up to the first territorial annexation in Europe since the end of the Second World War, which is what Mr. Putin accomplished in Crimea. So those things are directly related, and if people didn't want to accept this at the beginning, I think now, with 18 years of experience, it's astonishing to see how some people still refuse to accept it. And there's this ongoing debate between, some people call them idealists and realists when it comes to foreign policy. People talk about the conflict between interests and values when it comes to Western approaches to Russia. And again, those so-called realists say, let's forget about values, let's focus on interests. Well, you know what? At the end of the day, there's no conflict between interests and values, because there's not going to be a genuine partnership, because there's not going to be a convergence of any kind of interests between the democratic world on the one hand and an authoritarian kleptocracy that is Vladimir Putin's regime on the other. And so when democracy does return to Russia, which will happen one day, of course, it's going to be primarily in our interest, in the interest of Russian citizens. We won't be beaten up anymore. We won't be imprisoned. We will have a right to vote in free elections and so on. But I think it will also be in the interest of the entire international community to have a government in Moscow that both respects the rule of law at home and behaves as a responsible citizen on the international stage.
You backed us right up to my final question, so we can now turn to the audience for a few questions. We have about 5 minutes, I think. And just so we get to know all of you better, please identify yourself, and if you'd like, address the panel individually, if that suits you.
Thank you.
Sir.
Thank you very much. I'm Georgi Oniani from Transparency International Georgia. Great panel and great analysis, and I do share what Vladimir said. Definitely, there is the West has this responsibility really for creating this sense of impunity with Putin, and there's something should be done from the West as well. Very specific question. You said that there are many people who are discontent with what's going on there, and there's the whole generation who is looking at Putin, and they've seen only this one leader. But on the other hand, they've seen what a democracy is and what's going on in the West. So, but definitely that's not enough to make the regime change. So, what are the ways to empower that generation or those people? Because coming from, having Georgian experience of changing Shevardnadze's the stagnated and corrupt regime, The thing was that, first of all, someone should lead that, but on the other hand, there should be this total discontent with the system, and people should be fed up, really fed up with that. So how to make this level of being fed up to that level to make that change possible? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. And in fact, the main mission, the main goal of our movement, of the Open Russia movement, is to prepare for that time of change and is to work with that young generation because, again, one of the things that Russian history shows very clearly, as David and others have mentioned during this discussion today as well, is that major political changes in our country can start quickly and unexpectedly. You know, I don't think Vyacheslav Pleve, the Tsarist interior minister, when in 1904 he boasted of the small victorious war against Japan, I don't think he expected that as a result of that war, a year later, the country would be engulfed in a nationwide political strike and the Tsar would be forced to grant his citizens civil and political rights and a parliament. It was one small victorious war too many. I don't think that Lenin, when he spoke on the 22nd of January 1917 in Zurich to the young Swiss Social Democrats at the Volkshaus, and when he ended his speech with that famous phrase that my generation will not live to see the decisive battles of this coming revolution, I don't think he expected the Tsar to abdicate in 6 weeks. And as David mentioned, I don't think anybody at the beginning of August 1991 could have predicted that by the end of the month, the Soviet regime would no longer exist. And by the end of the year, neither would the Soviet Union. So one thing Russian history shows us is that major political change can come quickly. We're not in the business of prediction. We're in the business of preparation. We don't know exactly when or how this regime will come to an end, but we do know that it will, because nothing is forever. And as much as Mr. Putin would like to think that he is there forever, and sometimes he behaves as if he actually genuinely believes that, well, that's just not the case. And so what our mission is all about, as we see it, is to work with that young generation, the generation that will be in charge of Russia after Vladimir Putin, to help, exactly as you asked, to help empower them, to help them become active and informed citizens. And we do this in many ways. We have a lot of political education programs and election training programs. And we do events all over the country, and we put up people as candidates for example, in municipal election. We build campaigns around them with, to train volunteers and campaign staff and campaign managers. And a lot of people ask, well, how can you prepare for democratic governance in an authoritarian state? And admittedly, that's very difficult, but we use what instruments and what opportunities we have to help prepare that generation for tomorrow. I often compare it with, there was a famous Soviet pianist in the mid-20th century. His name was Rudolf Kara. He was ethnic German, so when the war began in 1941, he was exiled along with his family to the steppes of Kazakhstan. He was given 24 hours to leave, as most people were. Obviously, he didn't take a piano with him, couldn't. And so what he did when he was in exile, he took out a plank of wood and a knife, and he carved out a pretend keyboard. And he would practice on it every day so his fingers wouldn't forget. And he did that for 13 years. He was allowed to go back to Moscow under Khrushchev in 1954. And when he returned to Moscow, he went on to become a soloist at the Moscow Conservatoire. He taught at the Moscow Philharmonic. In 1962, he won the USSR-wide musical soloist competition. He was one of the most accomplished pianists of his time. And for 13 years, the guy had practiced on a plank of wood. This is what we're doing today. We want to help get that generation, the young generation, ready for that moment when they will face responsibility for Russia after Putin.
We have time for maybe 2 questions.
Bat Kuteli, Atlantic Council of Georgia. Thank you for a great discussion. And Lilia, by the way, not scary at all. What we've seen and what you discussed, that is Russian domestic propaganda imposes some kind of an irrational fears on its own society. One of those fears is that if Georgia or Ukraine becomes a NATO member country, something disastrous would happen. So my question is, if let's say Georgia soon in an accelerated manner becomes a NATO member country, even without solving the territorial issues, what would be the reaction from Russia or Putin? The question is to the Russian panelists, obviously. Thank you.
In the environment what we have right now, the whole situation right now, I don't think that would be just a dangerous undertaking. I don't think just something similar what we had in 2008 would be possible for Putin and his regime. And in fact, that's what I'm saying, just in that time, 2008, we lost this opportunity for Georgia and Ukraine, and I think it's possible now. Just the whole world now understands what Mr. Putin's regime is about. And Mr. Putin understands what the world's reaction is, at least on the Crimea and Donbass and Syria and other stuff. And that's why today completely different analysis could be given to that, to such a situation. Mr. Putin made a big mistake, annexing Crimea and having Donbass operation. And it was possible for him to make this mistake because of the Western mistake. Because after invasion in Georgia, there was a special plan, you remember, so-called Sarkozy plan at that time? None of the points put there were implemented by Putin, none of them. But 3 months after, business as usual appeared to be as a normal reality. 3 months after, reset launched, friendship, whatever, cooperation, etc. Georgia was forgotten. Mr. Putin taken this as a normal behavior. That's allowed way, stylistic of behavior for him in international arena. That's why he came with such thinking to Crimea. Now, I think this completely different understanding should be given to that.
Are we about out of time? Maybe one more? One more. Sir, I appointed you.
Thank you, great panel. What do you think about what are the foreign policy visions of the Russian political opposition in relation to the South Caucasus? Yeah, a question to both to Mr. Kasyanov and Mr. Karamurza.
My position is
when finally democracy returns to Russia.
My position, it's very clear, this position of my party and myself. We condemned all those annexations, in Georgia, in Ukraine and others, and that's why just our position is very clear. Georgia has an absolute sovereign right to determine its future. European choice, NATO, and all other things. Same to Ukraine, same to Moldova, same of course to Baltic states which already done this. This is absolutely a picture. And for me, just when I was in the cabinet, of course, at that time, I think Ambassador Tev just could recall that, and that time we had very good relations with the United States, with NATO. And that time we established the special council, Russian-NATO Council. That was other step. And I publicly already at that time said, just I dream when my country would be a full-fledged member of NATO. Mr. Putin at that time said, I don't exclude such a possibility, but at that time there was a direction of fruitful cooperation. Our secret services were in the full cooperation at that time, fighting with Al-Qaeda, and we had we given all these facilities here through Russia to come up to Afghanistan, even for troops and for other supplies, etc. We had good relations. But then, as we mentioned, just human rights violations started to appear. Remember, Vice President Cheney came to Lithuania and started to blame Putin for violation of human rights. Putin was shocked. Yeah, how come? I closed my eyes on your Iraqi operation. I thought the contract already there. But Americans and Bush and Cheney started to say, it's our values. We trust to God, we trust to human rights. Why are you violating human rights? Putin at that time just understood that it's not everything could he purchase on the international arena. And started changing his policy. And you remember later on just his speech when he said we are surrounded by enemies and all other things we already know.
Thank you. I'm getting the...
Don, just 2 words to follow up. Thank you for the question. And you know, one of the founding slogans of the Russian democratic movement going back decades was, or even centuries, I guess, Herzen was the first to raise that toast, for your freedom and ours. That's the slogan with which Russian dissidents went on Red Square in 1968 to protest Brezhnev's invasion of Czechoslovakia. And so that's very much relevant today. We believe in freedom for ourselves and for our neighbors, and the right of self-determination and sovereignty. and territorial integrity, just as the Prime Minister just said. And that ties in with the question that Ambassador Kotelia just asked, because if we step back from the Putin propaganda cliches and look at the genuine national interest of Russia, we will see that our most peaceful, our safest, our most secure borders are with NATO countries, which cannot be said, for example, on our border with China. And looking forward, it is very important to remind ourselves that, you know, civilizationally, we also belong to the Western civilization. Russia is a European country. Let's not forget about that. And when we still had a real parliament in Russia, when Boris Nemtsov was leader of SBS, which was a center-right opposition grouping in the State Duma, there was an official clause written in the party program that we want Russia one day to become a member of NATO. And that's an important civilizational choice. So once we're out of this paradigm, when the government of our country serves their own personal self-interest as opposed to the national interest of Russia, we want our country to be an aspiring member of the North Atlantic Alliance too. And, you know, there was a lot of times yesterday and today in the course of this conference, this famous slogan was mentioned, Europe, whole and free. Next year will mark the 30th anniversary of the Mainz speech by George H.W. Bush, who first proclaimed that slogan in West Germany. Well, let's not forget that the two largest countries in Europe are Russia and Ukraine. And Europe will not be whole and free until both of our countries take their rightful places within it.
A good note to conclude on. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for coming.